Hello and welcome to Guidance Review. I'm David Pudwill, and today we're going to be talking about FDA's refuse to accept policy for 510Ks. A couple key takeaways for today's video. One, 510K refuse to accept policies and procedures. Two, 510K refuse to accept principles. And three, the checklist used for acceptance review by FDA. So here we have the refuse to accept policy for 510Ks. It was published in September 2019, this version of it at least. And we'll go ahead and if we scroll down, we can download the final guidance and we can check out the docket. This is the 2012 docket. That was when one of the larger sets of changes was made to the refuse to accept policy. And here we see there are 13 results. There are just a handful of comments here from a couple large companies, from some individuals, and we can see some postings here from FDA as well. And we'll go ahead and check out the Abbreviated comments. Here are those specific comments made, and here's Abbreviated's. And this was September 27th, 2012. That they made these comments, and I won't really go into much detail in terms of what's here, but they made comments on the guidance itself for several of the sections here, line by line in terms of the guidance document, and then they also provided some comments regarding the acceptance checklists as well, and you can see that here, and then they included the draft guidance with line numbers. And this is the refuse to accept policy for 510Ks. And this document supersedes the refuse to accept policy for 510Ks issued February 21st, 2019. And here we see the original document was issued in 1994. Here's some ways to get more information about this guidance from FDA directly. And this particular guidance document applies to the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, as well as the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. And public comment can be submitted, and there are additional copies that can be requested as well. Here we can see the table of contents. We'll go through this, and then just a very high-level overview of the checklists themselves. The purpose of this document is to explain the procedures and criteria that FDA intends to use in assessing whether a premarket notification 510K submission meets a minimum threshold of acceptability and should be accepted for substantive review. Focusing FDA's review resources on complete submissions will provide a more efficient approach to ensuring that safe and effective medical devices reach patients as quickly as possible. Moreover, with the enactment of the Medical Device User Fee and Modernization Act of 2002, that's MEDUFMA, and Medical Device User Fee Amendments of 2007, that's MEDUFA, MEDUFA 2, MEDUFA 3, and MEDUFA 4, and currently we're looking at MEDUFA 5 negotiations coming up here very soon. FDA agreed to performance goals based on the timeliness of reviews. And acceptance review takes on additional importance in encouraging quality submissions from submitters so that you pass the refuse to accept or this acceptance review. And it allows FDA to appropriately concentrate resources on complete submissions. Therefore, there's an early review. This is within the first 15 calendar days, and we'll get into a little bit more detail there here later on. So here, FDA calls out that it is critical to distinguish between the completeness of the regulatory submission and the quality of the data provided and any studies conducted in support of the submission. The assessment of the completeness of the 510K occurs during the acceptance review, while the assessment of the quality of the submitted information occurs during the substantive review. FDA will base acceptance on the objective criteria outlined in the associated acceptance checklist and not on the quality of the data. And if we get into the background, again, the purpose of the 510K acceptance review is to assess whether a submission is administratively complete. in that it includes all of the information necessary for FDA to conduct a substantive review and reach a determination regarding substantial equivalence. The 510K regulations provide greater detail regarding the specific information that each premarket notification submission must contain. For example, the submission must include proposed labeling, a statement regarding the similarities and differences between the device and others of comparable type, supporting data, and FDA may request any additional information necessary to determine whether the device is substantially equivalent when the information provided is insufficient to enable such a determination. And here we're referred to a guidance document on the format for traditional and abbreviated 510Ks. And FDA is working on this as well with their eStar program. Prior guidances and checklists related to 510K RTA policy are identified here and focused on defining broad issues or principles. And the checklists associated with these guidances dealt largely with administrative elements but did not address specific content that is essential for 510K review. And as a result, FDA had accepted many inadequate submissions for review. I would say that was true prior to 2012. And the goal of the guidance published in 2012 was to clarify the content needed in traditional, abbreviated, and special 510K submissions to allow FDA to conduct a substantive review, thereby enhancing the quality of received 510K submissions and improving overall review time. I'm not sure here of the date because I believe that was actually January of 2013, but regardless. And here we see that the information presented in this document is intended to provide FDA staff with a clear, consistent approach for acceptance review for traditional, abbreviated, and special 510K notifications, and to outline the RTA policy on 510Ks. It will help submitters and also help FDA to conduct a substantive review. The acceptance policy does not alter the substantial equivalence decision-making process, importantly, once the submission has been accepted. However, it does alter the start of the FDA review clock for purposes of MDUFA performance goals for those submissions that are not accepted for review. If the submission is accepted for review, it doesn't change the review clock start time. But the review clock will reset if refused to accept decision is reached. This document does not address the monetary aspects of the MDUFA goals associated with 510Ks, and here's a link regarding that. In terms of Q-sub interactions, for general information regarding the 510K regulations, submitters should consult CDRH's Division of Industry and Consumer Education, or DICE, or also CBER's Manufacturer's Assistance and Technical Training Branch. Here's some information on how to submit a Q submission. And in addition, here are a couple other FDA guidance documents on the 510K program. 510K refused to accept policies and procedures. FDA staff will conduct an acceptance review of all traditional, abbreviated, or special 510Ks based on objective criteria using the applicable acceptance checklist, and they refer to appendices A to C, to ensure that the 510K is administratively complete. In order for the submission to be accepted, all administrative elements identified as RTA items should be present, or a rationale should be provided for those elements determined by the submitter to be not applicable. And I would suggest, just for your awareness, this in most cases is probably not going to be considered acceptable that you're providing a rationale for not including these elements. Now, if you've already had a 510K and you're not changing a number of aspects, I mean, that might be your justification, but really your rationale here needs to be based on either prior information that has already been submitted to FDA and accepted, or otherwise make sure that you're providing complete information. Potentially sterility information wouldn't be required because you have a device which is not sterile and generally wouldn't be sterilized. So something like that. But Just be careful about this here. And to aid in the administrative review, FDA recommends that submitters complete and submit acceptance checklists with their submissions that identify the location of supporting information for each RTA element. And we'll see a place for that in the actual RTA checklists. The acceptance review, which occurs prior to the substantive review, should be conducted and completed within 15 calendar days of FDA receiving the 510K notification. An acceptance review will only begin for 510K submissions for which the appropriate user fee has been paid and a validated e-copy has been received. So this is important to note as well. If you haven't paid the fee, or if you're on an e-copy hold, the refuse to accept or the acceptance review doesn't begin. So that all is a precursor to the beginning of the clock and the acceptance review. So once the payment is made, once the e-copy is accepted, then the submission comes into this 15-day clock where it can be reviewed just to ensure that it's administratively complete, that the submission is administratively complete. And here, FDA writes that the staff will select the applicable checklist based on the 510K type, and the acceptance review will be conducted on original 510K submissions and responses to RTA communications, but not supplements or amendments submitted in response to requests for additional information after a submission has been accepted. Now, keep in mind, even for additional information requests and responses to those, FDA will do an assessment of whether a response was included and whether FDA considers that to be adequate from an ability to review the information provided. So if you include something in terms of those additional information requests, they shouldn't be doing a substantive evaluation as sort of a refuse to accept, but FDA does refuse to accept even responses to additional information or requests, depending on whether that is a complete response. And here, FDA continues saying that the staff should assess whether the submission should be accepted by first answering the preliminary questions below, and then verifying that the submission contains all of the information identified as RTA items in the checklist. The purpose of the 510K acceptance review is to assess whether a submission is administratively complete, in that it includes all of the information necessary for FDA to conduct a substantive review. Therefore, the submission should not be accepted and should receive an RTA designation if one or more of the items noted as RTA items in the checklist are not present and no explanation is provided for the omissions. However, during the RTA review, FDA staff has discretion to determine whether missing checklist items are needed to ensure that the submission is administratively complete to allow the submission to be accepted. FDA staff also has the discretion to request missing checklist items interactively from submitters during the RTA review. Interaction during the RTA review is dependent on FDA staff's determination that outstanding issues are appropriate for interactive review and that adequate time is available for the submitter to provide supporting information and for FDA staff to assess responses before the acceptance deadline of 15 days. So this is something that may or may not happen during this initial review. So it's entirely possible FDA will reach out within this window and ask for information. If they do, just make sure that you're quickly responding and getting them what they're requesting. Otherwise, likely they'll put the submission on hold, and the clock will then restart. So you'll basically lose these, potentially 2 weeks of time in terms of when you would normally then get a final response. Or let's say first additional information request even. If one or more items noted as RTA items on the acceptance checklist are not present, FDA staff conducting the acceptance review should obtain management concurrence and notify the designated 510K contact person electronically that the submission has not been accepted. FDA staff should also provide the submitter with a copy of the completed checklist indicating which items are the basis for the RTA designation. The 510K submitter may respond to the RTA notification by providing the missing information identified in the checklist. The submitter should submit this information to be included in the file under the original assigned 510K number. A new submission and a new user fee are not necessary, nor is it necessary to resend the entire 510K submission unless FDA notes otherwise. And this could be maybe a language issue or a majority of items missing in the checklist. It is sufficient to submit and address only the information requested per the acceptance checklist. If a response to the RTA notification is not received within 180 days of the date of RTA notification, FDA will consider the 510K to be withdrawn and the submission will be closed in the system. Upon receipt of the newly submitted information, FDA staff should conduct the acceptance review again following the same procedure within 15 calendar days of receipt of the new information. The subsequent acceptance review will assess whether the new information makes the submission complete according to the checklist criteria for completion. And if the submission is still incomplete, FDA will notify the contact person and provide the new checklist indicating the missing items. When a submission is accepted, FDA staff should electronically notify the submission contact person that the 510K has been accepted and begin a substantive review of the submission to determine substantial equivalence. Should FDA fail or choose not to complete the acceptance review within the acceptance review period, the submitter should be electronically notified that the acceptance review was not completed and that the submission is under substantive review. So if FDA doesn't complete their review within that 15 days, it's automatically accepted. Now, FDA may request any information that may have resulted in an RTA designation during the substantive review, but they can't then put the submission on hold and restart the clock if they miss that 15 calendar day window. So FDA has been generally very good about doing that initial 15-day review because the benefit is if they do that review and they find that there's some administrative incompleteness, then they put that submission on hold and reset the clock. Once a submission has been accepted, FDA may ask for any information during the substantive review that may have been unintentionally overlooked during the acceptance review. And in terms of the review clock, as I explained earlier, here FDA days begin on the date of receipt of the submission or of the amendment to the submission that enables the submission to be accepted. That's for 510K or filed PMA. Thus, the FDA review clock does not start when a submission is placed on e-copy or user fee hold or a designated RTA or refuse to accept. So again, you need your e-copy to be complete. You need to have your user fee paid, and then the clock starts if you pass your acceptance checklist. If you don't, then you're reset in terms of the clock. And then once that submission happens again, the clock resets. FDA has 15 days. If they accept it, then the clock continues. If they refuse to accept it, then the clock again is halted, reset back to zero. 510K submissions and additional information submitted in response to a RTA designation are received by the respective center's Document Control Center, or DCC. The FDA review clock start date is the DCC receipt date of the most recent submission or additional information that resulted in an acceptance designation for the 510K, provided the submission user fee has been paid and a validated e-copy has been provided. In terms of notification of acceptance review result, the submitter should receive an electronic notification of the acceptance review result within 15 calendar days of receipt. And that is that the submission has been accepted, or that it hasn't been accepted, or that the submission is now under substantive review because the acceptance review was not completed. The notification will be sent only to the designated contact person identified in the submission. So make sure that you identify whoever you want that information to go to. Usually, at least when I was at FDA, this could be two people identified, sort of a primary and a secondary contact, and they would be notified. This notification will also serve to identify the FDA 510K lead reviewer, because that's who the notification is going to come from, the way that FDA's automated systems are set up. And this will tell you who the lead reviewer is that's assigned to the submission. That's who the email should come from. And the notification of either the acceptance or RTA designation will be made only with supervisory concurrence of the reviewer's acceptance review determination. The notification of acceptance or RTA designation may occur on any day prior to the 15th calendar day of DCC receipt. However, in the event the acceptance review was not conducted, a notification that an RTA review was not conducted will be sent on the 16th day. And this is just going to be automated. In the case of RTA designation, the notification should be accompanied by the completed checklist indicating the missing elements that resulted in the RTA designation. The completed checklists are considered part of the submission's administrative file and will not be posted publicly. Therefore, it is imperative that the submission identify complete contact information, including the email address to which the notification should be sent. Otherwise, you won't be notified in a timely way. And refuse to accept principles. In order to use this guidance appropriately, FDA staff should review the following basic principles regarding FDA's review policies and procedures. Acceptance should not be based on a substantive review of the information provided in the 510(k) notification. It is important to make the distinction between the acceptance review and the substantive review. The acceptance review is conducted to assess whether the submission contains all the appropriate elements as identified in the applicable checklist in order to begin a substantive review. In assessing whether a 510(k) notification should be accepted, submitted information is not evaluated for adequacy to support a finding of substantial equivalence. The checklist is a tool to ensure that the submission contains the necessary information in order to conduct a substantive review. The evaluation of the quality of the content and the substantial equivalence decision-making process occur within the substantive review once the file has been accepted. FDA staff should determine whether the submitter provided a justification for any alternative approach. The submitter may provide a rationale for why any criteria in the checklist are not applicable to the device. Just, again, be careful about that. And likewise, the submitter may provide a rationale for any deviation from a device-specific or cross-cutting guidance document or FDA-recognized standard. Again, even for this, I would be cautious and just make sure that you know what you're doing if you take this route. It is FDA's expectation that each item in the checklist will be addressed either by including the requested information or providing a rationale for why it is not applicable or why there is a deviation. FDA will not consider a given criterion in the checklist to be present if the submission fails to include either the information requested or a rationale for omission or deviation. If a justification to omit certain information or for taking an alternative approach is provided, FDA will consider the adequacy of that justification or alternative approach during substantive review of the submission. See acceptance review section below for examples and further explanation. Device-specific and cross-cutting guidance documents, applicable recognized standards, and applicable regulations will be considered when making an RTA determination. Before submitting a 510(k), the submitter should consider the currently available guidance documents and standards, as well as applicable regulations for the proposed device in the preparation of the submission. FDA staff and industry are encouraged to refer to the product classification database to assist in identifying any applicable recognized consensus standards. If citing voluntary consensus standards, the submitter should consider FDA's guidance appropriate use of voluntary consensus standards in premarket submissions for medical devices. Specifically, the checklist includes questions regarding whether the submission has addressed recommendations regarding the device description, labeling, and performance testing as outlined in a device-specific guidance, special controls, or another specific regulation. Note that addressed means that the submission includes information pertinent to those recommendations or requirements. Assessment of the adequacy of that information in meeting those recommendations or requirements should be assessed during the actual review. This is a bit of a tricky framing because this should be addressed during, I guess I would say, the substantive review. If there is a device-specific guidance other than a special controls guidance document, The submission includes information to establish that the submitter has addressed the recommendations or otherwise provided an alternative approach intended to address the applicable statutory and/or regulatory criteria. If there are special controls applicable to the device, the submission includes information addressing the particular mitigation measures set forth in the special controls or uses alternative mitigation measures and provides a rationale to demonstrate that those alternative measures identified by the submitter will provide at least an equivalent assurance of safety and effectiveness. This is the kind of language that raises some concerns about what a completeness versus a substantive review end up being. And we get into the checklist. Preliminary questions. Within, again, 15 calendar days, FDA staff should answer the preliminary questions below, which are included on the first page of the acceptance checklist for traditional and abbreviated 510Ks. FDA does not intend for the submitter to have addressed these items in their submission. Depending on the answers to these preliminary questions, the remainder of the acceptance review may or may not be necessary. If the responses to the preliminary questions and subsequent consultation with the center personnel identified below indicate that the 510K acceptance review should not continue, the 510K lead reviewer should promptly inform the 510K review team and notify the submitter using proper administrative procedures. So these preliminary questions are whether the product is a device or a combination product with the device constituent part subject to review in a 510K. If yes, then you proceed. If not, then the lead reviewer should consult with the CDRH Product Jurisdiction Officer or CBER Product Jurisdiction Officer to determine the appropriate action and inform management. Is the submission with the appropriate center? Here, if the submission is for a single entity device that appears to be subject to review in a center different from the one to which it was submitted, or if it is for a combination product with a device constituent part and it appears that a center different from the one to which it was submitted has the lead, the 510K lead reviewer should consult with the CDRH Product Jurisdiction Officer or the CBER Product Jurisdiction Officer to determine the appropriate action and inform management. If a determination is reached that the product is with the wrong center, then the 510K review team will stop the review and notify the submitter. If a request for designation, that's an RFD, was submitted for the device or combination product with a device constituent part and assigned to your center, identify the RFD number and confirm the following. Is the device or combination product the same as that presented in the RFD submission? And are the indications for use for the device or combination product identified in the 510K the same as those identified in the RFD submission? And then here we get into if so, then was an RFD determination made? And is the product with the center that the RFD identified that the device or combination product should be with? And here, specifically, if the device or combination product has been modified or the indications for use have been modified, then again, this may need to be reevaluated by the Office of Combination Products and then determine the appropriate action and inform management. Is the submission for a combination product that contains as a constituent part a drug that has the same active moiety as an approved drug with exclusivity as described here? If the submission is for a combination product and contains as a constituent a drug which has the same moiety as an approved drug with exclusivity, then the lead reviewer should contact the CDRH Product Jurisdictional Officer or CBER Product Jurisdiction Officer to determine the appropriate action and inform management. And then we see, is this device type eligible for a 510K? FDA staff should determine whether the 510K submission is for a device type for which a 510K is known to be an inappropriate regulatory approach, such as when the device type is Class 3 and a PMA is required, or the device type is Class 1 or 2 and 510K exempt. If a 510K is not appropriate, FDA staff should make this determination during the acceptance review and notify the submitter of the determination. This preliminary question is not intended to identify submissions for which a substantive review is required in order to determine if 510K is an appropriate approach, such as a device that has a new intended use or a device that has different technological characteristics that raise different questions of safety and effectiveness. And then 6, is there a pending PMA for the same device with the same indications for use? And here, if yes, then the review team should stop the review and consult management and other center resources to determine which pre-market review pathway applies to the device and the appropriate processes for addressing the situation. FDA staff should also consult management and other center resources if a 510K and PMA have been submitted for the same device type by different submitters. If clinical studies have been submitted, is the submitter the subject of an application integrity policy, or AIP? This is a very bad list to be on. If you're on this list, you're in trouble. And if the submitter is on the list, the reviewer should consult CDRH Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, or Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis, Division of Clinical Science and Quality. So this group here, OPEC, OCEA, DCEA 1, or CBER, Office of Compliance and Biologics Quality, Division of Inspections and Surveillance, Bioresearch Monitoring Branch, or OCBQ, DIS, BMB, to determine the appropriate action. This application integrity policy is for submitters who have been known to provide fraudulent information, or for some other reason they've ended up on this very bad list. There aren't very many folks who end up on that list. And then we get into the checklists. For the acceptance review, we've got organizational elements. Although missing one or more of the items in the table of organizational elements in the acceptance checklists, such as a table of contents or page numbers, generally will not lead to an RTA decision. FDA strongly encourages submitters to incorporate these elements in their submissions to facilitate FDA review and decision making. If, however, the submission is so disorganized that FDA cannot locate the information needed to assess substantial equivalence, or if the submission is so poorly written that the information submitted to support substantial equivalence cannot be understood, the submission should receive an RTA decision. And then here we have elements of a complete submission, or RTA items. The objective criteria in these checklists outline those elements that are explicitly required by regulation or that are essential to FDA's substantive review of the submission and determination of substantial equivalence under Section 513I of the FD&C Act. For example, proposed labels, labeling, and instructions are required, while a description of the materials, design, and other features of the device is essential to determining whether its technological characteristics are the same as those of the predicate and whether any differences raise different questions of safety and effectiveness under Section 513I. FDA has also identified several categories and subcategories of data and information that, when applicable, are critical to supporting a statement indicating the device is similar to and or different from other products of comparable type, and the substantial equivalence determination. For example, if the new device has direct or indirect tissue contacting components, a biocompatibility assessment will be essential to evaluating whether the new device is as safe as the predicate with respect to the risk of toxicity that it poses to the patient. While testing and data would usually be necessary for such an assessment, this is not always the case. For example, if the device under review and the predicate are identical in all relevant aspects, and acceptance should be based only on the presence of an item or an explanation why the item is not applicable, such as all the same identical materials have been used, similar to, let's say, your own predicate device, and not the adequacy of such explanation. If the device has no direct or indirect tissue contacting components, no biocompatibility assessment would be necessary and the biocompatibility elements on the checklist would not be applicable. Because the applicability of these categories is also critical to the substantial equivalence determination in order to be accepted, all submissions should include a statement indicating whether these categories apply as outlined in the acceptance checklist. When performance data are provided, the submission of full test reports describing how the testing was conducted is crucial to FDA's assessment of whether the data support a finding of substantial equivalence. Now, this would be, again, for traditional 510Ks. Where a device-specific guidance document exists for the subject device, the submitter should follow the recommendations included in that document, or the submitter should provide a rationale for assessing the scientific issues discussed in the guidance document using an alternative approach intended to address the applicable statutory and/or regulatory criteria. In the absence of the recommended information and without a rationale for an alternative approach, the submission should be considered incomplete and not accepted. If special controls have been identified, those controls should be addressed in order for the submission to be accepted, or alternative mitigation measures provided to demonstrate that those alternative measures will provide at least an equivalent assurance of safety and effectiveness. In terms of applying the checklist of RTA items, using the acceptance checklist appropriate to the submission type, that is traditional, abbreviated, or special, within 15 calendar days of receipt of the 510K, FDA staff should answer each question for the elements identified as RTA items. For those items that have an option of yes, no, or not applicable as an answer, the item should receive an answer of yes or not applicable for the 510K submission to be accepted for substantive review. For the first question in each section related to the need for certain performance data, FDA staff should indicate whether the submission has addressed one of the options for the 510K submission to be accepted for substantive review. Elements marked not applicable. In developing the checklist, FDA has considered the general categories and respective subcategories of information that are necessary to conduct a substantive review for the wide range of medical devices that are appropriate for review under 510K. All such criteria may not be pertinent to a particular device. Therefore, FDA staff should select not applicable for those elements that do not apply to the subject device. For example, the requirements for financial certification and disclosure statements and statements of compliance for clinical investigations only apply to submissions with clinical data. If the submission contains no clinical data, FDA staff should select not applicable. And then here, in terms of adequacy of information, in order to make the checklist criteria objective for each RTA item, FDA should consider only the presence or omission of the element or a rationale for the omission of the element or use of an alternative approach during acceptance review. It is likely that FDA staff will encounter scenarios where information is provided but is incomplete or inadequate. In such instances, FDA staff should answer the question for the respective item as yes, but may communicate the inadequacy or request additional information in the course of the substantive review. For example, the submitter may have provided full test reports for all performance testing. However, during the acceptance review, the reviewer may note that the results of a particular test may not be sufficient to support a finding of substantial equivalence, and additional justification would be needed. And this is just from a very high-level review. Sometimes you come across things that are obviously inadequate, but they're present. So FDA shouldn't go out of their way looking for this kind of information around the substantive review aspects, but having done literally hundreds of 510K reviews, I can appreciate that in your initial review, you sometimes come across these kinds of things. The performance testing criterion would be marked yes in the checklist, and the full assessment of the results and communication to the submitter that additional justification is needed should occur during the substantive review. So at times, some of this had been included in the RTA checklist, but FDA is pretty clear here that they would want to see this communicated separately outside of the RTA checklist. During RTA review, issues may be identified that do not determine the acceptability of a submission, but are issues that should be resolved prior to a final decision. This does not mean that complete review of the submission has been conducted. These identified issues are referred to as observations. If observations are identified, they will be attached to the RTA checklist that is sent to the official contact. This attachment is called an addendum. You do not need to provide a response to the observations in your RTA response in order for your file to be considered administratively complete and accepted for substantive review. However, addressing these questions could help to facilitate the substantive review of your submission. So again, this is where while they won't show up in the RTA checklist, there could be these observations that are maybe more of a substantive review kind of a question that could be included as an addendum. In terms of elements marked no, for any acceptance criterion designated as no, FDA intends to provide an explanation to describe the missing elements if needed. This explanation is particularly important for a criterion in which it may not be immediately apparent to the submitter what necessary information specifically is not present. For example, the device description section includes an element that states submission addresses device description recommendations outlined in the device-specific guidance document, and a notation of no alone may not be sufficient to inform the submitter of what specific pieces of information are missing. FDA staff should include a list or statement of the additional information that is necessary to meet the acceptance criteria, and this list or statement can be communicated in the comment section of the checklist. And here, in terms of prior submissions relevant to the submission under review, for certain submissions, the submitter may have made prior submissions for the same device for which FDA provided feedback related to the data or information needed to support substantial equivalence. It could be a Q-sub or an IDE, a prior NSC determination, or a prior 510K that was deleted or withdrawn. When such prior feedback is relevant to determining whether substantial equivalence of the subject device exists, the new submission should include information to address this prior feedback, and the checklists should include criteria related to this issue. To address the criterion regarding whether a prior submission or no prior submission exists, FDA recommends that submitters provide this information in Section F, prior related submissions section of the CDRH premarket review submission cover sheet, and submitters should list prior submission numbers in Section F of this form or state that there were no prior submissions to address this criterion. Please be advised that leaving this section of the form blank will not be considered a statement that there were no prior submissions. This information may also be included in the cover letter. Again, a statement that there were no prior submissions, or a listing of the numbers of the prior submissions. Where one or more prior submissions do exist, FDA suggests designating a separate section of the submission that identifies the prior submissions by number, including a copy of the FDA feedback. That could be a letter or meeting minutes, and state how or where in the submission this prior feedback was addressed. Note that the adequacy of how the feedback was addressed should be assessed during the substantive review. And here, in terms of combination product administrative items, the 21st Century Cures Act requires submitters seeking action on a combination product to identify the product as such. Additionally, per the amended Section 503G, 5 submissions for device-led device-drug combination products must include the patent certification or statement as described in Section 505B2 and provide notice as described in Section 505B3 if the combination product contains as a constituent part an approved drug. If this is applicable to you, make sure that you're addressing it. And here are submissions of combination products that do not contain as a constituent part an approved drug. If the combination products do not include as a constituent part an approved drug, submitters of device-led device-drug combination products should mark not applicable for question 10. And submitters of combination products that contain as a constituent part an approved drug, make sure that this is addressed if relevant to you. However, for a method of use patent which does not claim a use for which a submitter is seeking approval, the submitter should include a statement that the method of use patent does not claim such use. Submitters, including a certification, should also certify that they will provide notice to the owner of the patents, yada, yada, yada. And then we get into conversion of special 510K to traditional 510K. FDA has developed a separate checklist to address the differences in content for special and traditional 510K submissions. FDA staff will utilize the appropriate checklist based on the file type as designated by the submitter. In the event that the submitter has submitted a special 510K, but FDA determines that the file should be converted to a traditional 510K, FDA will notify the contact person designated in the 510K submission of the conversion and the rationale for the conversion. If the file is converted from a special to a traditional within 15 calendar days, the traditional 510K acceptance checklist will be used to conduct the acceptance review, and the review clock start date will be assigned as outlined in the 510K refuse to accept policies and procedures above. Here's the kicker. Given the differences in content for special and traditional 510Ks, it is likely that the converted submission will result in an RTA designation using the traditional acceptance checklist. FDA staff should provide the completed acceptance checklist for traditional submissions indicating which elements are missing. The submitter may respond by providing the identified information, and the subsequent acceptance review will proceed with the traditional checklist. If the file is converted from a special to a traditional after the 15 calendar day acceptance review period, any missing information that would have resulted in RTA designation should be obtained during the substantive review. And that's the end of the guidance, and then we really get into the appendices here. And here we've got an acceptance checklist for traditional 510Ks, some detail here. This is the checklist that FDA uses and goes through, and this is where you should provide some information. You can fill out these preliminary questions if you want, and is generally, I would say, a good idea to do so. And then we get into the section where you really have to pay attention, and this is going to be where you should really identify the page number, identify that all of this information is included, and identify, again, that page number where relevant. Sometimes there are multiple pages. It might be helpful to include, or a range of pages. And just be aware that if you have any no answers here, you need to make sure that you address that before you submit it. Otherwise, your submission will be found administratively incomplete. So just make sure you're using the right checklist for the type of 510K submission that you're doing. And I don't know, happy trails. We've got pages and pages and pages, as you can see here. We've got pages and pages and pages of RTA checklists. It's the vast majority of the guidance document here. And then we get down to the digital signature concurrence tables. Well, that would be at the end of each of these individual pieces. So just make sure that all of this information is included. Make sure you take a look at all of the relevant subsections. As FDA fills these out, it ends up looking a little bit cleaner than what ends up in this guidance document, because sections will potentially disappear as they're not applicable. But yeah, here's all the information for you to go through, and we'll go ahead and wrap things up with a couple again key points for you to take away from today's video. So really want you to take away one, the 510K refuse to accept policies and procedures, which we went through. Two, some 510K refuse to accept principles. And three, just understand the content that needs to be included in the checklists that are used for the acceptance review. And hopefully you found today's video informative, useful, and really look forward to any comments or feedback you may have. And again, we rely on your input to drive future content and videos. And so if you've got a suggestion, please let us know. Otherwise, have yourself a wonderful day, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thank you. Bye.